Well, hello, everybody, and it's so wonderful that we can be together like this with Dr. Liza van der Merwe. And just to give you a little bit of a bio, I want to read Liza's background. She's married to Fani, been married for 29 years, wonderful 3 decades of good married life. They have a daughter called Abigail, who's just finished school. And Liza sees the world as interconnected systems. So we've come to the right place here today as we try to work out complexities and things. She works at our South African National Power Utility as an enterprise resilience assessor. To be able to make sense of the utility resilience challenge that she's working in, she actually went ahead and just completed an interdisciplinary PhD in complexity and resilience thinking. And, and that she did through Stellenbosch University, which is also my alma mater. She has been a kingdom ambassador since getting saved in 1986. So she's been a Christ follower for many, many years and has been involved in short-term missions. She served as a missions mobilizer. That's wonderful. Love to hear more about that at some time. And also serves as a volunteer in her local church. So she's a sister, very much involved in the local church, very much involved in mission, very much involved in what we are really trying to work out as we prayerfully look to the Lord to show us how we can continue to serve as modern day urban and suburban missionaries. And so, you know, the whole idea of all of this is really for us to find out, how can we reach our city? I love what David Burdray keeps asking. What is it going to take for us to reach the people in our city with the gospel in an effective way? And we want to be able to discern where God is at work. We want to be able to join him in what he is doing and get behind his kingdom mission. And in order to answer these questions, you know, it's just so important for us to understand the complex sociology of our cities and then determine how the gospel moves in the most natural way into the lives of the people that we naturally do life with on a day-to-day basis. So, Doc, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jacques. Now, for the sake of the audience, I want them to know that your background is an air traffic controller in the Air Force. And perhaps I'm going to invite you, if you want to say anything about that, because that's going to be relevant in our conversation today. But let me just say, in response to your invitation, and thank you so much for that lovely invitation and introduction, is that all along when I was doing my PhD, it was in response to God's call and anointing and blessing on my life. Every single Sunday in church, as I praised and worshipped, I committed myself again and afresh and anew. It's like, God, for your glory, I'm doing this through you and for you, and to extend your kingdom and bring glory to you. And as a result, I was able to, from start to finish, while working full time, complete my PhD in 3 years, which is...
That's incredible.
Yeah. So, and it is God. It's because of him and for him and through him. And that's why I'm so grateful for this opportunity to take what I've learned there in this academic context, applying it in a secular context, and bring it to kingdom, because it's from him and through him and for him. But let's hear, what are some of those questions? Or do you want to tell us something about your background that would be relevant for this?
Guys, I actually, what I'm doing at the moment is I lead a church. That's kind of the main thing that I do. We planted a congregation. I use the word congregation. In recent months, I've been kind of thinking more about saying we planted a missional community, a community of faith in Midrand, which is situated in the Gauteng province in South Africa, for those of you who are in another part of the world. And it's right in the middle of the 2 major cities, Pretoria and Johannesburg. And Gauteng is pretty much the economic hub of our country. They say if anybody sneezes, when Joburg sneezes, the whole of Africa gets a cold. And it's just, that's the kind of level of influence and impact that the city actually has on our continent. And so I counted a wonderful privilege to be living and working and ministering in the city. Our church is very new and very young, and we've really in recent months been exploring how can we as a local church continue to effectively serve the vision that God has given to us. Our desire is to see our city saturated with people who know and love and follow Jesus with all their hearts, and to help people get and keep God first in their lives. And so we called the church God First Church. Now, I haven't been a minister all my life. I've been doing this for a number of years now, but there was a big overlap where I was working in the Air Force, as you heard from Dr. Liza. I worked as an air traffic controller, a military air traffic controller, and kind of understand the complexity of a three-dimensional kind of world, and kind of living in all of that and trying to be a jack of all trades at the same time, moving traffic in confined airspaces and making sure that people move in the most safe and efficient way in their aeroplanes from one place to the next, and achieving a goal. And doing that on a day-to-day basis where every single day is completely different. And I think, it kind of works for ministry in a number of ways, because we're dealing with so much complexity in our cities, and there's so much going on, and it's very difficult to put things into a box. We constantly need to be reinventing ourselves and working things out, and working it out within the parameters of a biblical mandate, and what that kind of looks like for us. So that's just a little bit about me and what I'm doing. And I also do a bit of other work bivocationally as a life coach, a mentor, counselor as well, and trying to kind of engage with my affinities in a way that I can serve as a gospel for the a channel for the gospel, and hopefully have an impact on people's lives that way as well. Thanks
for Jacques. Very awesome. So you mentioned that you had some questions for me.
Yes, yeah. So we've spoken about complexity and resilience, and just the complicated things that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Why don't you just explain to us, just open up to us the difference between clear, complicated, and complex systems?
Awesome. Now, knowing that you're an air traffic controller, let me tell you a story, and one that you're probably very familiar with. So I'm gonna just share my screen so that you guys can see what I've prepared for you. Jacques, let me know when you can see that.
I can see it.
So way back in the 15th of January of 2009, an Airbus A320 piloted by Captain Chesley Sullenberger and co-piloted by Jeff Skiles departed from New York, from the LaGuardia airport, on a cross-continental flight all the way to Seattle on Washington. That's as far across the continent of North America as you can get. And they were going to stop over in North Carolina. Now, the thing is, on that particular day, 1 minute after takeoff, suddenly at an altitude of 860 meters high, that is just over the roof of the tallest building in the world, the flight path of the aeroplane of a migrating flock of Canadian geese intersected. The pilots suddenly saw this flock of large birds right in their faces, so much so that it casted shadows in the cabin. Moments later, the passengers and the crew heard large bangs. The aeroplane was shaking violently. They saw flames coming out of both engines. This was followed by silence, and then the smell of singeing feathers and fuel. They had lost all engine power, and they were at very low altitude. The air traffic controller, Patrick Harton, arranged for them quickly to return to LaGuardia for an emergency landing. And 35 seconds after Sally introduced that they had a bird strike, he said, "We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson." And then Harton was like, "Okay, what else can we do? How can we help you?" And he organized another runway at Teterboro. And Sally said, "We can't do it. We're going to be in the Hudson." Harton was shocked and cold to the core. It actually took him several hours before he knew that the guys had survived. And this incident became known as the Miracle on the Hudson, because on that cold day, the air temperature was at -7 degrees Celsius. That's 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The water temperature, 5 degrees Celsius, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Coincidentally, Captain Sully was formerly a glider pilot. So he knew, he had experience how to fly a plane without any engines, without any thrust. And incidentally, the Airbus carried life vests and additional rafts and slides, even though that was not required for the route. Coincidence. And the nearby ferries that were taking passengers across the river came and approached to pick up the passengers before the aeroplane sunk to the bottom of the river. Now, before I have used this story as an introduction and an illustration to answer your question, Jacques. And I'm going to do that by referring to something called the Cynefin sense-making framework. And you can read more about it at cynefincenter.com. But what I offer you today is how to make sense of complexity and how we can leverage that complexity for kingdom advantage. So firstly, when something happens, there is this sudden, shocking surprise. You've never thought this would happen. This is unpredictable. It's unprecedented. There's different levels of neurological responses, how our brain and our whole nervous system respond to what happens. At the first level, we freeze or we faint. Ostrich. Or possum. At the second level, we fight or we flee. And that's also ostrich, because the ostrich would also kick you or he would run away with those long legs fast. But the third level is where we are choosing to rather engage with that complexity and to make sense of how to act. And that's where sense making comes in. Sense making is about how do you engage with what is going on here. And at first, everything is confused. Everything right here in your face is just confusion. Because what just happened? How to make sense of it so that we know how to act. Now, in the Cynefin sense-making framework, the two sides of the framework, on the one hand, refers to things that are linear versus non-linear. So in a linear context, everything happens the way it's always happened. I can say, I've been there, I've done that, I've seen that, I've got experience. Yes, it has turned out exactly the way I predicted. But in a non-linear context, a small action can result in huge, unpredictable outcomes. Or lots and lots and lots of effort can produce very little outcome. Now, if I think of a friend of mine that's been serving unreached people groups as a translator with Wycliffe for 30 years in a Muslim community in Mozambique. And at the end of 30 years, they were 2 believers. And recently, there is such atrocities happening in that country. Whole villages, people are, it's just atrocious. And in this trauma, people are now getting saved in huge numbers. Or it is like finding that cultural key that suddenly you just start sharing the gospel and everybody say, when can I be baptized? That's typical of a non-linear response. Now, on the linear side, we have domains that it would be clear and complicated, and complex and chaotic on the non-linear side. So let me clarify what this is from the incident. When it started, confusion, absolute confusion, and many people were confused for a very long time. From the time that this aeroplane took off until it was in the river and everybody were out, 5 minutes. It was so super fast. People hardly had time to figure out what is going on. But as you are engaging with this complexity and see, how can I act? Not faint or freeze, fight or flee, but how can I act? How can I engage with what is happening? What can I do? Then So the confusion is the one in the middle. On the left-hand side, we have chaos. In that chaos of what happened, nothing stays in chaos. The moment there's predictable patterns of behavior happening again, it's no longer in chaos. Chaos is the one domain on Kinefin that is unnatural. You fall into it and you want to get out of it as soon as possible. So when that accident happened, it was absolute chaos. And in chaos, there is no time for thoughtful reflection or analytically probing it. The only thing that makes sense in chaos is to act. It's the only option. You act and you see if it works and you keep on acting. That's your only response in chaos. Now, what is interesting regarding the A320, its engines has been designed to withstand bird strikes. It can take hummingbirds, swallows, doves, can even take a smallish chicken, but not a goose. It was designed to withstand a bird strike of up to 1.8 kilograms, and a Canadian goose is about 4 kilos each, and this was a whole flock of them. So it was very clear from an engineering design perspective, from anybody could expect that goose in engine failure. End of story. So that's a clear example of a clear context. Now, when it comes to being a pilot of an Airbus, you need to have done flight simulation training, flight schools, lots and lots of regulatory training, lots and lots of discipline, standard operating procedures, show your compliance to the regulations, ensure that you can follow all the checklists almost with your eyes closed. But there was no time for this. The reason why the incident investigation took 18 months after this, everybody was saved. Not a single soul was lost. There were some injuries, but everybody was saved. But yet, this serious accident had a protracted investigation because none of the rules were followed. The standard operating procedures, the emergency checklists, was not followed. And Captain Sullenberger, interestingly enough, said that there was no time to follow the rules. He knew if he did what the book said, that there would be loss of lives. And he couldn't do any of that. And that's why I love it. The best pilot knows when to break the rules. So the planning assumptions on the complicated side did not foresee, imagine, envisioned, predicted, catered for this complexity, this unpredictable event. Very, very often when a complex situation happens, you realize that my planning assumptions have all been proven wrong by the reality of what's happening here. The final incident investigation report said there's 4 reasons why these guys were all saved. Good decision making and teamwork by the cockpit crew. The fact that they had the life vests and the additional rafts and slides. The performance of the flight crew, and the proximity of the working vessels from the ferries that came and picked them up from the ditching site. So you know what? Their conclusion of this investigation was it is the human variability that makes dynamics systems safe, not our plans, our procedures, our regulations, our compliance, but our ability to react in the moment, in response to the moment, based on what this moment needs. Now, I want to draw your attention here to the bottom of this thing. There's this interesting wiggly here. And that's because the difference between a clear context and chaos is like a cliff. If you're planning assumptions for what is supposedly clear is wrong, you come too close to this chaos, you can tip over and fall into chaos. Now, one of the planning assumptions, or the assumptions at the conclusions afterwards, that was wrong. How long, Jacques, has people been flying? at this stage of the game, maybe 100 years or more. And there has not been an Egyptian goose collision of this nature. However, officers decided, you know what? To prevent this from happening again, let's kill the geese. So by the middle of that year, 2009, about 3,000 geese were killed in New York to stop this from happening again. Now, let me ask you, if after COVID, we eradicate all the bats on Earth, is that going to stop us from having another pandemic? It can happen with pigs. It can happen with camels. It can happen with so many different things. The assumption that you can eradicate the things through which it came last time and therefore prevent all things happening in future is flawed. Now, if I can just go a little bit more into what these various domains are, just so that you become more comfortable how to distinguish them and what to do in these various responses. And the big take home from this is I want you to realize that the approaches that you follow are only applicable within its domain. Do not apply complicated rule sets to a complex context. You're bound to fail. So in the clear context, there's a very clear one-to-one correlation between cause and effect. Because of that, right answers exist. So what you can do is to establish the rules for best practice and enforce compliance. Everybody knows what to do. It's obvious what the answer is. However, in the complicated context, causes can result in multiple effects, and multiple effects or outcomes could have actually been caused by different things. So now what? How do you make sense of this? This is why this is the domain of the experts. You need to get the experts to come and do analysis, to do their root cause, trace root cause of what is it that actually caused this incident, to come to that singular thing that caused the dominoes to tip. This is where we're implementing good practice management, like in business, we would have quality management systems, safety management systems, environmental management systems. These are all on the assumption that cause and effect is linearly correlated and it's complicated. And more than one right answer exists. More than one right answer is possible. And that's why this is not a best practice domain. It's a good practice domain. However, when things are complex, that's when the single, if you're asking me what is the one word that describes complexity, it's uncertainty. And that uncertainty has so many implications. It means that there are no experts. I may be a doctor in complexity, but it means that I will always know that I will be uncertain in that context. Get used to it. Uncertainty is not something that we must avoid, run away from. It's something we must embrace, live with, and find opportunities in. That uncertainty means that whatever is going to come is going to be unpredictable. But what we have, there's always an organic growth. There's always life. Things are happening. It changes while you're not looking. It changes even when you are not acting. Things are changing. And the reason why it changes so much is because all the agents in the system have agency. Those geese had agency about where they're going to be. And the other thing about complexity is agents self-organize. They change, they look at what's happening and then they change. Sully told the air traffic controller, I can't make it. I'm going to go to the Hudson. Where did he read that? Where did he see that? Where did he learn about that before? It emerged in the context with him engaging with this complexity and what are my options? And he said, I'm going to be in the Hudson. Those ferries that were taking their passengers to the other side said, I'm going to go pick up those people. And that's why it worked. This is what happens in complexity. There are no right answers, but we should establish guiding principles. And I know 248 is looking into that and have a set of guiding principles. Stick to your guiding principles, not to the rules, the regulations, and the standard operating procedures. Let that be your anchor. Adapt to the patterns that emerge in that local context. There is no such thing that I can take the recipe of what worked in Midrand with Pastor Jacques' church and go and apply that in any other city that's between two metropolitan areas and hope to have the same outcome that he has had. Because the context is different. In any complex context, observe, watch, see, listen to the system. Have your finger on the pulse of what is emerging. Emerging is, if something emerged, then there's an outcome that's being produced that we cannot attribute to the agents that's there. It's more than the sum of the parts. It's an emergent outcome. Adapt to patterns that emerge in context. When things are chaotic, that's crisis and emergency stuff. And that's where there is no time looking for answers. This is not the time was like, what caused that plane to fly into that building? Where did they come from? Which flight was that? You don't care. At that moment, the only thing that you do is to urgently intervene to stabilize the situation. This is when you act and later on see whether what you've done is actually helping. So these are a quick overview of the various types of domains, how to recognize them, and a one-liner of how to do that. Now, Jacques, let me ask you a question. See how much you've listened. Was this an emergency landing, true or false?
That's a brilliant question. Well, it was an emergency and they had to land the aeroplane. And, like you say, Sully just adapted to the situation. It's interesting how the air traffic controller tried to keep him within the parameters of normal standard operating procedures in an emergency context, and how Sully just needed to adapt and make the necessary adjustments and save lives. I think if they'd followed the traditional procedures, they probably would have lost the airplane and all the souls on board. But he definitely had to land the airplane, and it is an emergency situation. So as an air traffic controller, I see it as an emergency landing. And so
now,
the answer to the question is true.
Aha, thank you for that. So I'm going to point you back to Kynefin and ask you, in which context is there a clear cause and effect and a one answer? True or false?
In which context?
Answer? Okay, don't worry.
Yeah.
It's the wrong question. And I deliberately tricked you, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
It is not an emergency landing because it's not that simple. The answer is much more nuanced than that. This was not an emergency landing. This was a best example of a successful ditching of a passenger plane on water. And if you go and read about all the conversations that happened in the aviation industry about that, people had a big argument. This is not an emergency landing. So I'm sorry to have put you on the spot. This was a ditching, a successful ditching, not an emergency landing. Now, you may ask me, so what? Why are you telling all of this? So what? This is like, okay, it's an interesting story, but what does that have to do with the city and the gospel and disciple-making movements? I propose that this is a very useful heuristic to make sense of a situation and to guide an appropriate response. So therefore, I'm going to invite you, Jacques, go and do this with your church. And any one of you listening in your city teams, go and do a brainstorm on this. And there's 2 flip charts that you need. On the one, brainstorm the whole list of challenges. Let everybody come up with anything between 3 and 5 of the most challenging challenges that you've encountered in your city, and brainstorm all of that on little post-it notes or whatever. And then go and place them on the chart and see which of your real life experiences are clear, complicated, complex, or chaotic, or confused. And please, in the beginning, everything isn't confused because like, what is this? And as you're engaging with it, you're debating it, you're having conversation about that. And collectively, you guys are making sense of what is happening. Then you can take it out of confused and start moving it into those other areas. If you struggle, let me give you some advice. If you take everybody's post-it notes and you start sorting them one by one between the most complex on the left-hand bottom side, and you make an upside down U to the simplest on the right hand side in the bottom, then you've got more or less the outlay. And now the only thing that you need to decide is, where do you draw the line between, is it complex or chaos? Is it complex or complicated? Is it complicated or clear? Exactly where is that dividing line between them? And I've given you some tips on how to think about that: linear, non-linear, single cause and effect, etc. Now, this is on your one flip chart. Now, what you then do is you repeat the whole exercise, but this time you're doing it for, what are the interventions that we've come up with? What are the solutions we've deployed in our city? What are the programs that we have rolled out? And take those solutions and interventions and similarly go and categorize them according to where they fit in. And you should have a flip chart with our challenges and a flip chart with our solutions and our answers to these problems, and then relate and evaluate the balance between the nature of the problems and the nature of the interventions that you have tried up to now. So, Jacques, I'm sorry that was such a long-winded answer to the question, but how do you make sense of that?
So yeah, that's really brilliant. I think for me personally, I'm going to need time to just process all of that information, and I'm really looking forward to working that out with my team as well. And I just thank you for the really practical tips on how we can then begin to look at the complexities that we are facing, the challenges, as you say, that we are facing in our unique situations, and then see how they fit into those 4 quadrants, and then try and see.
Remember the one in the middle.
For 5 is the confused is in the middle, right?
Yes.
So the five quadrants. Thanks very much for that. That makes a lot of sense. And then to see how have we done up until now in terms of what interventions, program solutions we have had, and try to implement, and then what needs to change, and how can we do things differently going forward, considering the complexity. I mean, just on that, Liza, I mean, why do you think it's so important for us as ministry leaders, as catalysts and champions in our respective contexts, to actually understand complexity for the sake of being a whole lot more effective missionally?
The world is complex. The default condition in the world is complex. The more we have learned and applied our particular Western way of thinking to reduce things that previously was only qualifiable to quantifiable stuff, to be able to predict, control, manage, and have a predictable outcome. The more and more we've leaned towards reducing everything that's complex to complicated. That's wonderful. It's brilliant. The advances that we've made as a result of that, technological innovations. We've placed people on the moon. We're going to place people on Mars. We are all the technology you're holding in your hands that's making such a difference to our economic growth is due to our advances on complicated stuff and what the experts has brought to us. However, we should not lose our ability to deal with complexity. So the reason why it's so important is because we've grown so in love with complicated approaches that we're assuming it can solve all problems. And there's bounded applicability to approaches because you are bounded for unintended outcomes if you're going to try complicated approaches to complex problems. And this is actually not a new problem that we've got because of Newton and Cartesian formulations and everything. It was there in Jesus' days, because who were the experts?
Yeah, the teachers of the law.
The teachers of the law, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what did they do? They reduced religion to a set of rules, and they were then enforcing the governing constraints. They were setting the rules of what to do and what not to do. It's all that it became. And isn't it true in church today that so much of religion has been reduced to a list of do's and don'ts? As long as you do these things and you don't do those things and you tick these boxes, then you are guaranteed the passport to heaven. Does it work like that?
No, not at all, because those methodologies have just proved themselves completely wrong, isn't it? And of course, we're not saved by law; we're saved by the grace of God and the work of the Spirit in our lives.
Absolutely. This has been so. If you look at what Jesus did in his ministry, every single time he went into a city, his approach was unique. Every time he approached a blind person, whatever, he did something different. He didn't have a recipe and a standard procedure, and his approach wasn't groomed by Discipleship College. It was unique to the context, to the complexity of the context and the needs of the current situation.
That's amazing, actually, Liza. So I'm trying to process all of this as a ministry leader myself, and just looking at your grid. I think people are confused. The primal questions of where do I come from, where am I going, why am I on earth? I don't have clarity of purpose, I'm confused about why I'm here, and it results in a whole lot of chaos, and then people try to work things out in a clear way. Like you say, Western thinking is linear, whereas African and non-Western thinking is very circular. And then we try to come up with solutions to what we perceive to be complicated issues, when actually it's a complexity that we're living in. And like you say, I mean, for as long as you are alive, you've got your PhD, you've done your studies, you've done everything. While you're living in the world of complexity, there will always be uncertainty. There will always be unpredictability. And so the question is, how do we minister into that with the gospel, remaining true to scripture, following the example of Jesus, knowing that, going back to Sully, which, he is just such a brilliant leader in that situation. You say for 5 minutes he was leading and he brought about an outcome, which was organic. Like you say, there's agency at play. People self-organize. So in that sort of reality and living with human variability, what sort of tips could you give to us? What next steps could we take as ministers to help our communities to be increasingly effectively missional in the complex environment? Because that's the reality. I mean, I think what you've helped me to do at this particular point is actually move from complexity. I mean, so from complicated solutions to a space of complexity, and actually understanding that this is actually where I'm living right now, and how I need to minister is the big challenge.
Thank you for that question, Jacques. My first recommendation is always expect the unexpected.
Wow. Okay.
And embrace the uncertainty that comes with that. So much of our business management systems, like your ISOs, is to reduce uncertainty. And I would suggest, in the complex world, uncertainty is irreducible. We have to embrace it. We have to accept it. We have to learn to navigate that. Learn to monitor how the wind is blowing, how the tide is flowing, and go with that flow. If you look at the Polynesians and how they managed to discover and navigate the whole of the Pacific Ocean, they did that through something that their elders were called wayfinders. They learned to sense the signs in the external environment. Look at how the birds are flying, how the ocean is ebbing and how it's flowing, and what they look at the sea. And from that, they were determining what is going on, where do we need to go. the future will be different from the past. We cannot expect that it's going to be the way it's always been. Therefore, what we need to do in the amidst of this complexity and this uncertainty is to experiment, learn from our experiments, and adapt.
And that's
There's
okay.
no recipes.
And that is okay.
Absolutely. If it's uncertain, if you don't know where it's going, it's unpredictable, how will you know what to do unless you try? So try something, experiment, ensure your experiment is safe to fail. In the engineering approach, we design something to be fail-safe. In the complex world, we have to design it to be safe to fail.
Right.
So it's small enough that you can roll back without losing face, and just try it. Just try it. What is beautiful about this is so often throughout the Bible, God describes the kingdom as a mystery. Now, in the complicated context, we're building puzzles. All you need is find another piece and you can look at the picture and you can build it. In the complex context, we are dealing with mystery. So it's about having the courage and the conviction to enter in to this complexity and partner with the God of mystery to unveil a kingdom whose rules are so completely different from the world.
Right.
And then 2 more points that I want to highlight to answer your question. We spend a lot of time dancing on the dance floor. I want to invite you and the listeners here to spend as much time on the balcony than on the dance floor. So sometimes leave the dance floor and go up and look from another vantage point, from a higher perspective at the whole lay of the land. Go and fly your city on Google Earth. Whatever it takes, go and look at where's the nooks and the crannies. How does the rivers flow? If a big flood comes through, like what happened in China the other day, in 3 days, they had as much rain as it normally rains within a year. Which areas are going to be flooded if that rain comes over your city? Ensure that you walk the land, that you're looking at where's the hills. Go to the hills and look at the valleys, both from a dancing floor as well as from a balcony perspective. And then the last thing is ensure that you know what is the rules of the game that you play. In chess, we have it's a finite game. A finite game is one where there's a predefined set of players, there's a defined set of rules, and when we're playing the game, there's a beginning and a middle and an end, and we know the objective is to win, and there will always be a winner and there's always a loser. But we are not playing finite games when it comes to kingdom. There's no finite games in complexity. There are finite games within the infinite game, okay? And finite games are great. Going to play rugby, soccer, cricket, whatever it is, there's a lot of finite games. But extending the kingdom is not a finite game. It's an infinite game. On an infinite game, what you've got, there is an unknown number of players. At any point in time, players can leave and others can join. There is no defined rules. So people play by whatever rules they feel like. And because the objective of playing the infinite game is to play that you can keep on playing. Now, how do you play in your city that you have the social license to operate at an ongoing basis? How do you show up? How do you present yourself as an ambassador of the King and his kingdom in disciple-making movements? Play in such a way that you can keep on playing.
Sure. It feels like we've kind of gone as far as we can at this point, because there's so much to process here. And I just love what you said at the end. that I think, to settle in our hearts that we are in a complex environment, and to understand that it's more about taking a principles approach than a methodology or rules and regulations approach, to try and answer complicated questions. And to, I think of Jesus and Nicodemus, where he says the Spirit moves, the wind blows where it wants to. I mean, he's referencing life in the Spirit, isn't he? And then the Apostle Paul saying, now that we live by the Spirit, let's walk in step with the Spirit. And then later on in Galatians, he says, and so as we bear each other's burdens, as we play the game, let's apply the law of Christ, which is the law of love. I think that's the only rule, is to love, and to love unconditionally, because this is an eternal game. And then definitely from time to time, I suppose, for us, in sort of catalytic contexts, to be spending much more time on the balcony to try and get a God view of our city than to be on the dance floor. Of course, we're on the dance floor. We it's the day-to-day bump and grind of life, and that's where most of our people in our missional communities are living. But to be able to keep bringing people back to the God view the whole time, so that we understand and are adapting to the uncertainties and the unpredictabilities that we're facing day in and day out. Is that an accurate enough summary? I mean, is there anything sort of, parting words, something that you just want to put tools into our hands to say, okay, for the next thing, do this? I mean, you've given us some good stuff, but any sort of last things? Firstly, have I summarized this correctly?
Yes,
am I bringing it through to context? Yeah.
And Jacques, I must say, even though I've known about Carnarvon for a very long time, it is fascinating when it comes to applying it in context, and look at the implications of that, because it's not about what's the theory of the framework. It is, how does that apply to my context today, and what does that invite me to do differently?
Right.
And that's where the benefit is.
And I love what you say. It's doing things differently, not trying to do things better, just differently. Let's be led by the Spirit. Help us with that, Lord. Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been an absolutely wonderfully enlightening time with you. And thank you for just helping us to see complexity a whole lot more clearly, and to understand what that is all about. And I hope that this has served you in a wonderful way, that you are coming away with more questions than answers, which is good, as we continue to wrestle with how we can serve as effective missionaries, taking the gospel into our city, and knowing that God has brought people into this complex environment, so that they might feel their way towards the Lord and find him, like Paul says to the Athenian philosophers in Acts chapter 17. God bless you. I look forward to the next time that we get together like this, and hopefully we can hear some more from Dr. Liza van der Merwe. Liza, thank you so much, and may the Lord continue to use you powerfully in your environment right there as a disciple maker, living with gospel intentionality, and at the same time continue to use you to touch many people's lives, so that they could come to a wonderful saving knowledge of Jesus.